June 1864. The dawn mist over Cold Harbor carried the smell of rain, sweat, and black powder. In the gray half-light, thousands of Union soldiers crouched behind low ridges of earth, shallow trenches carved hastily through the night with bayonets, tin cups, and bare hands. The ground was wet clay, heavy and clinging. Some men muttered prayers. Others simply stared ahead into the fog where the Confederate lines lay waiting. They had orders to attack at first light. At 4:30 a.m., the bugles sounded. The men rose. The line surged forward across an open field, blue coats vanishing into smoke. Then came the thunder. Within 7 minutes, nearly 7,000 Union soldiers fell. Entire brigades were erased before reaching halfway. The survivors dropped flat, clawing again at the ground, desperate for cover. By sunrise, the assault was over. The living refused to move. They dug deeper instead. That morning, without realizing it, the Union Army crossed an invisible line in military history. What began as an act of fear, men scraping dirt to shield their bodies, became a revelation. The earth itself was now a weapon, a wall stronger than courage and cheaper than blood. The Civil War began as a contest of movement, of banners and bayonets, fought in open fields by armies that still worshipped the memory of Napoleon. But by 1864, something new had emerged from the slaughter. The rifled musket, the Minié ball, and modern artillery had made the open battlefield suicidal. Industrial technology had made bravery obsolete. And so the soldiers adapted, not through invention, but instinct. They learned to survive by digging, to fight by enduring, to measure progress not in miles, but in inches of dirt. In the months that followed, these shallow pits became elaborate systems of fortifications stretching for miles across Virginia. To the generals, it looked like stagnation. To the soldiers, it felt like salvation. What they could not know was that they were building the blueprint for the next century's wars. The trenches of Petersburg, the earthworks of Atlanta, the rifle pits at Spotsylvania, these were not anomalies. They were the first signs of a new world of warfare. The men who dug them did not set out to make history. They were only trying to stay alive. Yet in the mud of Virginia, they accidentally invented the future. When the Civil War began in the spring of 1861, most of the men who volunteered to fight believed they were stepping into a page from history, a war of banners, drums, and gallantry. They pictured quick campaigns and glorious victories, fought by gentlemen in bright uniforms and neat lines. Their officers encouraged that fantasy. Many were trained under the long shadow of Napoleon, men who still believed that courage and order on the battlefield were stronger than any bullet. What they did not yet understand was that the Industrial Revolution had already rewritten the laws of war. At First Bull Run, outside Manassas, Virginia, the Union Army marched out confident and naive. They wore wool uniforms in the July heat, advanced in parade formation, and carried smoothbore muskets that their commanders thought would decide the day. Then the Confederates opened fire with rifled muskets, Springfield and Enfield models that could kill accurately at 600 yards, nearly triple the effective range of the old weapons. The result was chaos. Formations shattered before they even came within musket range. The air filled with a mechanical scream, and men dropped in rows. When it was over, both sides staggered away, shocked by the scale of the killing. Still, the lesson didn't sink in. In 1862, generals on both sides continued to plan their battles like it was 1815. They clung to the idea that a bold frontal assault could break an enemy line through sheer willpower. But now, the weapons had changed the equation. The Minié ball, a conical lead bullet, spun with deadly accuracy from rifled barrels. It could pierce bone and muscle at long range, causing wounds so catastrophic that amputation became the only treatment. The artillery had evolved too. Lighter, rifled cannon like the 3-inch ordnance rifle and the Parrott gun could fire explosive shells with terrifying precision. At Antietam in September 1862, this new technology met the old tactics head-on. Union and Confederate forces clashed in open cornfields near Sharpsburg, Maryland. The fighting raged for 12 hours. Soldiers advanced shoulder to shoulder through the rows of corn, only to be mown down by volleys they never saw coming. By the end of the day, more than 23,000 men lay dead or wounded, the bloodiest single day in American history. "We stood and fired until the barrels of our guns were too hot to touch," one survivor wrote. The field became a vision of modern hell: smoke, blood, and the moan of thousands of wounded men caught between lines that dared not move. Yet even after Antietam, the commanders still believed in attack. The cult of courage remained powerful. At Fredericksburg that December, General Ambrose Burnside ordered wave after wave of Union soldiers to charge up a sloping field toward a stone wall manned by Confederate infantry. The Confederates, protected behind a slight rise and an earthen bank, waited until the attackers were within easy range. Then they fired. The result was slaughter. The Union Army lost 12,600 men in a single day. Not one assault reached the wall. Afterward, the snow fell over the corpses that covered the field, and the Potomac ran red. In those early years, the soldiers learned faster than their officers. By instinct, they began to hug the ground, to crawl instead of march, to use fence rails, ditches, and fallen logs for cover. A few even started digging shallow holes with bayonets or tin plates when they halted under fire. Their commanders called it cowardice. The men knew better. "A live coward is worth more than a dead hero," one private wrote after Fredericksburg. The truth was brutal but simple. The human body could not outrun the new firepower. The war had become a math problem: steel and powder versus flesh and bone. And the math was merciless. The rifle musket had turned the open battlefield into a death trap. Courage could no longer carry a line, it could only fill graves. By the end of 1862, both armies were exhausted. The old war of movement, the marches, the charges, the pageantry, was dying. In its place came something darker and more deliberate. Soldiers no longer asked how to win glory, but how to stay alive. They didn't yet have a word for what they were creating. But in the fields of Virginia, Tennessee, and Maryland, a new kind of warfare was beginning to take shape. Not through strategy, but through survival. The officers would cling to their tactics a little longer. The soldiers, pressed to the ground by invisible fire, were already inventing the future. By the summer of 1863, the optimism that had fueled the early years of the war had rotted away. Both armies were exhausted, marching on nerves and rations. The Union soldiers who followed General Ulysses S. Grant down the Mississippi River didn't dream of glory anymore. They dreamed of surviving. When they reached Vicksburg, perched on its high bluffs above the river, they found something unlike any battlefield they had known. The Confederates had carved an entire city of dirt and timber into the hillsides. It was a fortress made of earth, and it changed everything. Grant's first instinct was still old school. He ordered 2 direct assaults on the Confederate lines, one on May 19th, another on May 20th, 1863. Both ended the same way: thousands of Union soldiers pinned down in the open under a storm of musket and artillery fire. The dead and wounded lay in rows along the slopes, unable to advance or retreat. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with the stench of powder and decay. "It was not war," one officer wrote, "it was murder." Something broke in those days after the assaults. The men began to dig, first out of desperation, then out of method. They scraped shallow ditches to cover their wounded, then lengthened them, connecting one to another until they formed a chain of earthworks creeping toward the Confederate lines. They dug saps, narrow trenches that zigzagged forward, and built parallels, long defensive lines for artillery and reserves. They rolled heavy barrels filled with cotton and hides, sap rollers, to protect their heads as they worked. Within weeks, the once open fields around Vicksburg had become a crawling network of trenches, craters, and firing pits. This was not the grand maneuver warfare their officers had studied at West Point. It was something grimmier, more human, and more ingenious. The soldiers learned that a spade could do what a rifle could not: keep a man alive. They built firing steps, dug bomb-proof shelters, and learned to reinforce parapets with logs and sandbags. Artillery crews hollowed caves into the clay hills for protection. Every inch forward was bought with dirt and sweat instead of blood. For the first time, the Union Army began to use the earth itself as a strategic tool. Grant adapted quickly. He ordered engineers to design a systematic siege, directing entire brigades to dig day and night. By June, Union trenches were so close to the Confederate works that soldiers could toss stones or insults across the lines. The siege had turned into a slow strangulation, and Vicksburg was running out of food, ammunition, and time. Inside the city, civilians huddled in caves carved into the cliffs. Outside, the Union troops became something new: engineers, miners, and sappers in blue uniforms. They tunneled beneath the Confederate bastions, packing the chambers with gunpowder. On June 25th, they detonated one of these mines, blasting open a section of the defenses. The explosion created a crater 50 feet wide and 12 feet deep, a forerunner of the massive explosions that would later shake the Western Front in France. When the Confederate garrison finally surrendered on July 4, 1863, the victory was not won by courage or maneuver, but by engineering, by men who had learned to fight the ground itself. The siege of Vicksburg proved that persistence, logistics, and fortification could achieve what sheer bravery could not. Grant's men emerged filthy, half-starved, and pale from the trenches, but they carried a hard new lesson. In this war, survival meant digging. The officers began to take notice. Reports from Vicksburg described in precise detail how the saps and parallels were constructed, how many yards per day a regiment could advance, how many shovels were needed for every 100 men. It was the beginning of a science. Field fortification turned from instinct into method. Manuals would later codify it, but in 1863 it was born from trial and terror. For the soldiers, the shift was psychological as much as tactical. The same men who once marched across open fields now looked for cover instinctively. Courage no longer meant standing tall under fire. It meant digging faster than the next volley. "The spade is the brother of the musket," one private wrote home. "The one saves life, the other takes it." By the end of 1863, the habit had spread across the Army. At Chattanooga, at Missionary Ridge, and in the tangled forests of Virginia, soldiers on both sides carried entrenching tools as if they were weapons. They didn't know it yet, but they were rewriting the playbook of war. The generals still dreamed of glorious charges and decisive battles. The men in the mud knew better. They had discovered a new truth of the industrial age. When steel meets flesh, the earth is the only ally that endures. By 1864, the Civil War had become a grinding machine. The battles no longer had beginnings or endings, just phases of the same endless slaughter. The Union Army, now under Ulysses S. Grant's command, pressed south toward Richmond through Virginia's tangled wilderness. His plan was simple in theory and brutal in practice: fight continuously until the Confederacy ran out of men, food, and time. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," Grant wrote. It would take nearly a year. In May, his army plunged into the wilderness, a choking forest of tangled undergrowth and thick smoke. Rifles and artillery turned the woods into a furnace. Visibility dropped to a few yards. Soldiers fired blindly through the haze, unable to see the enemy. When night fell, the forest caught fire. burning the wounded alive where they lay. The dead could not be buried. The living could not move. It was a glimpse of the future. War fought not on open fields, but in choking, confined hellscapes. Grant didn't retreat. He shifted east toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, determined to keep pressure on Lee's army. But the pattern repeated. Attack, stall, dig. Every time the two armies collided, they dug trenches as soon as they stopped moving. The men didn't need orders anymore. Within hours, they could turn a patch of forest into a fortress. Logs stacked shoulder-high, dirt heaped for cover, shallow firing pits lined with brush. Soldiers joked that the Army of the Potomac could throw up works faster than a dog can scratch. It wasn't really a joke. At Spotsylvania, the earth itself became a living thing, chewed, clawed, and churned. The Mule Shoe salient, a bulging Confederate line, was attacked again and again. For 20 straight hours on May 12th, Union and Confederate soldiers fought hand-to-hand in driving rain, packed shoulder to shoulder in knee-deep mud, their muskets too soaked to fire. They stabbed with bayonets and clubbed each other with rifle butts over a muddy parapet that came to be called the Bloody Angle. By morning, the earthwork had collapsed into a trench filled with bodies. Soldiers wrote that the dead formed a wall higher than the living could climb. This was no longer the war of open-field charges and maneuver. It was a siege that kept moving, each battle birthing new trenches, each advance followed by entrenchment. The war had slowed, but it hadn't weakened. It had hardened. The reasons were as much technological as tactical. The rifle musket, already deadly, was now joined by repeating rifles like the Spencer and Henry, capable of firing 7 rounds without reloading. Artillery improved too, lighter, more accurate, and more plentiful. The telegraph linked divisions, coordinating simultaneous attacks across miles of front. Railroads fed entire armies, like arteries of steel. But these same innovations made the battlefield less fluid. The faster armies could communicate and reinforce, the harder it became to break through. Every failed assault was met with a new trench line, deeper and stronger than the last. The Union Army adapted with industrial precision. Quartermasters issued standardized entrenching tools, small shovels and picks carried by each infantryman. Engineer battalions developed procedures: how to lay out a trench, how to slope parapets, how to build abatis, fallen trees sharpened into defensive barriers. Maps of the Virginia countryside began to look like blueprints of a factory floor. Every contour line a defensive work, every ridge a potential redoubt. The war had entered its mechanical phase. By June, the two armies met again at Cold Harbor, and Grant tried one last massive assault. The results were immediate and catastrophic. Confederate rifle fire shredded the Union advance within minutes. Entire brigades vanished. The survivors fell flat and refused to move, clawing the dirt to stay alive. We felt we had lost all, and were hopeless, one soldier wrote. But we could still dig. Grant halted further attacks, haunted by the loss. His army began to move south toward Petersburg, where Lee's last supply lines fed Richmond. But the lesson of Cold Harbor was indelible. Open field assault was suicide. The war had entered the age of entrenchment. From this point forward, the spade became as essential as the rifle. Each halt meant fortify. Each night meant dig. Soldiers slept behind parapets and awoke under bombardment. When they advanced, they brought their earthworks with them, rolling forward with sandbags and timber, carving safety out of soil. Even the vocabulary of the army changed. Rifle pits, bomb-proofs, covered ways. They were no longer just soldiers. They were engineers of survival. To the generals, the static lines felt like paralysis. To the men in the mud, it was evolution. They had learned what their commanders had not: that courage without protection was wasted, that the ground beneath them was worth more than 1,000 speeches about honor. The war of movement was over. The War of the Earth had begun. By the time the Union Army reached Petersburg that June, both sides were already living in trenches that stretched for miles. The soldiers didn't realize it then, but they were standing at the dawn of a new age of warfare, one where progress would be measured not in miles, but in yards of dirt won and held. By the summer of 1864, the war had dug itself into the earth. Grant's army had swung south after Cold Harbor, crossing the James River to cut the Confederate supply lines that fed Richmond. The target was Petersburg, a crucial rail hub, the lifeline of Lee's army. But when the Union troops reached its outskirts in mid-June, they found not an open field but a wall of earth. The Confederates, now veterans of defense, had spent months fortifying every approach with deep trenches, redoubts, and artillery emplacements. Petersburg was no longer a city. It was a labyrinth of mud and fear. The Union attacked anyway. On June 15th, their initial assault drove the defenders back, but hesitation cost them everything. By the next morning, Lee's men had arrived and filled the gaps. The opportunity for a quick victory vanished. From that day forward, Petersburg ceased to be a battle and became a siege. 10 long months of digging, tunneling, and dying. The lines soon stretched over 30 miles, from the outskirts of Petersburg to the defenses of Richmond. Between them lay a strip of hell called No Man's Land, where sharpshooters ruled the daylight and mortars ruled the night. The constant shelling turned the ground into a moonscape. Men learned to walk hunched, to sleep with dirt over their heads, to whisper rather than shout. The trenches were lined with sandbags and logs, reinforced by the engineers who had become the Army's most valuable soldiers. They designed zigzag communication trenches, connecting front and rear lines, bomb-proof shelters roofed with timber, and observation posts built into tree trunks. Each army mirrored the other so precisely that it was sometimes hard to tell who was the besieger and who was besieged. Life inside the trenches was a slow erosion of body and spirit. In the summer heat, the stench of decay was everywhere. Rotting food, unburied bodies, open latrines. Rain turned the clay to sludge. Men sank ankle-deep as they moved. Rats thrived, so did lice. Yet, there was routine. Soldiers brewed coffee over small fires, mended boots, and wrote letters home describing a life spent underground. "We have become moles," one man wrote, "and live like them too." Each day, the Union engineers extended their lines a little farther, closing the noose around Petersburg. They built roads and rail spurs to feed the army, laying track almost to the front lines. Supply wagons came and went under cover of night, bringing shovels, lumber, powder, and food. By the winter of 1864, Grant's army had become a city unto itself, a self-sustaining organism of mud and industry. Telegraph lines snaked through the trenches. Steam engines churned behind the lines, powering sawmills and pumps. The war had fused with the industrial age, yet the most daring experiment came from beneath the ground. In July 1864, a regiment of Pennsylvania coal miners proposed an audacious plan: dig a tunnel under the Confederate defenses and plant a massive powder charge. The officers laughed at first, but Grant gave his approval. The miners went to work, carving a 511-foot tunnel by hand, hauling out the dirt in sandbags and wooden boxes. They lined the passage with timbers and packed 8,000 pounds of black powder into a chamber beneath a Confederate strongpoint known as Elliott's Salient. On the morning of July 30th, they lit the fuse. At 4:44 a.m., the earth erupted. The explosion blasted a crater 170 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep, killing hundreds of Confederate soldiers instantly. For a few stunned minutes, the Union line watched in silence. Then came the order to attack, and disaster followed. Poor coordination and confusion turned the moment of surprise into chaos. The assaulting troops, many of them black soldiers of the United States colored troops, charged directly into the crater, thinking it was a path through. The loose soil and steep walls trapped them. Confederate artillery zeroed in and turned the pit into a slaughterhouse. By noon, the opportunity was gone. What should have been a breakthrough became one of the war's most senseless massacres. The Battle of the Crater became a symbol of both innovation and horror, proof that this new kind of warfare was as cruel as it was ingenious. The soldiers had learned to weaponize the ground itself, to kill without ever seeing the enemy. It was a grim foreshadowing of what the world would witness again 50 years later in France and Belgium. After the crater, the siege settled back into its deadly rhythm. Union sappers tunneled closer. Confederate sharpshooters watched for movement, and artillery duels rumbled day and night. By winter, the trenches around Petersburg had become a permanent landscape, frozen, filthy, and filled with men who had forgotten what open ground looked like. When Petersburg finally fell in April 1865, the Union troops who entered it did so through the very trenches they had carved. The earth had swallowed 10 months of their lives, but it had delivered victory. What no one yet grasped was that Petersburg had done more than decide a campaign. It had shown the future. The rifle, the shovel, and the spade had fused into a single system of war. The soldiers who fought there had not just endured the trenches, they had built the blueprint for the next century's battlefields. By the winter of 1864, the war had vanished beneath the earth. The lines outside Petersburg were no longer temporary fortifications. They were a way of life. The soldiers who had once marched across open fields now lived like burrowing creatures, swallowed by the ground they fought to hold. The air smelled of damp clay and gunpowder. Snow collected in the trench bottoms, where it mixed with mud and blood, until everything turned the same brown-gray color. In the frozen dark, the soldiers adapted. They built bomb-proofs, crude shelters dug into the walls of the trenches and roofed with logs, dirt, and canvas. Inside, they lit candles, played cards, boiled coffee, and read newspapers weeks out of date. They slept on straw, their rifles stacked by the door. The lucky ones scrounged tin stoves or pieces of iron to fashion makeshift heaters. When shells screamed overhead, the men barely looked up. They had learned to listen for the sound of an incoming round, to judge its path by instinct. The veterans could tell by ear whether it would land near or far, and only ducked if they had to. The trenches became towns. Wooden walkways lined the main routes. Soldiers gave the sections names: Fort Hell, Fort Damnation, the Covered Way. Telegraph wires ran through the rear lines, connecting regiments like streets in a city. Mail wagons arrived daily. Sutlers sold tobacco, hardtack, and tinned peaches at inflated prices. Chaplains held services in dugouts by lantern light. Even the rats grew bold, fattened on crumbs and corpses. Men cursed them, then shared their food with them. They were part of the ecosystem now, as much residents of the siege as the soldiers themselves. Disease was constant. The cramped quarters bred dysentery, lice, and pneumonia. Frostbite took toes and fingers. The water from shallow wells turned foul with seepage from nearby graves. And yet, the soldiers endured. After years of war, they had become craftsmen of survival. They perfected their defenses, deepened their trenches, and built firing platforms high enough to give an angle of return fire over the parapets. "The shovel," one Union officer wrote, "has saved more lives this winter than all the doctors in Virginia." Psychologically, the change was profound. The young men who had once cheered at the sound of a bugle now met every order with weary precision. They no longer dreamed of sweeping charges or banners in the wind. Victory had become something measured in feet gained or a night survived. The trench was a cocoon of sorts, filthy but familiar. It made men feel oddly safe. When ordered to advance into open ground, they hesitated. When told to dig in, they relaxed. It was the opposite of what their generals had been trained to expect. Across the lines, the Confederate soldiers lived the same way. The gray and the blue mirrored one another, often separated by only a few dozen yards. They could hear each other talking, coughing, singing. Sometimes they traded coffee for tobacco under flags of truce. In other moments, they tried to kill one another with hand grenades made from tin cans and gunpowder. The war had shrunk to a human scale, a contest of endurance between men who saw each other's faces every morning across the same strip of no man's land. When the weather froze hard enough, some soldiers climbed out of the trenches and met in the middle to exchange newspapers or jokes. There were moments when the war seemed to pause, suspended between exhaustion and absurdity. One Union private described a truce day as two armies at peace, staring at each other across an invisible line, each pretending the other was not starving. But the peace never lasted. When the thaw came in March, the fighting resumed with a violence that felt personal. Lee's army was starving, its ranks thinned by desertion and disease. Grant's was stretched thin, but still fed and reinforced by the endless industrial power of the North. The siege could end only one way. In early April, the Union broke through the Confederate right flank at Five Forks, and the line collapsed. The trenches that had protected Lee's army for nearly a year now became its prison. As his men fled west toward Appomattox, they abandoned the fortifications that had defined their lives. The Union troops who entered the empty Confederate trenches found them eerily familiar. Same layout, same stench, same makeshift comforts. The two armies had become reflections of one another. When the guns finally fell silent days later, the men who emerged from those holes were changed. They had spent months living underground, their hands calloused from the spade as much as the rifle. Some could no longer sleep without the feeling of earth close around them. They had learned, in the most brutal classroom imaginable, that the nature of war had changed forever. The open battlefield, the place of glory, banners, and charges, was gone. In its place was a new landscape of endurance, where courage meant patience and victory meant survival. The soldiers did not yet know the name for what they had built. The world would one day call it trench warfare. For them, it was simply life, and it was the only way to see another sunrise. When the war finally ended in April 1865, the soldiers who emerged from the trenches around Petersburg stepped into a world that no longer resembled the one they had left. They were ghosts of two armies that had spent nearly a year underground, men who had learned to live, fight, and think in the dirt. Some were so accustomed to sleeping beneath logs and earth that when they returned home, they couldn't rest in a bed with open space above them. Others still dug trenches around their campsites at night, out of reflex. They had survived by turning the ground itself into armor, and that instinct would follow them long after the guns fell silent. In Washington, generals and engineers began trying to make sense of what the war had taught them. The reports from Vicksburg, Spotsylvania, and Petersburg were compiled and studied by officers who saw, perhaps dimly, that something revolutionary had occurred. Major J.G. Barnard of the U.S. Army Engineers published detailed accounts of siege operations, complete with diagrams of trenches, parallels, and saps. Captain Nathaniel Mickler produced precise surveys of the Petersburg lines, mapping the first modern system of continuous fortifications ever built on American soil. These weren't battlefield curiosities anymore. They were manuals for the future. At West Point, instructors began teaching field fortification, not as a last resort, but as standard doctrine. The next generation of officers learned that digging was as fundamental to survival as marksmanship. They studied how to angle parapets, how to design bomb-proofs against vertical fire, how to use elevation and drainage to keep trenches dry. A new kind of warfare, slow, industrial, methodical, had been born almost by accident, and now it was being systematized. Europe noticed, too. Military observers had visited both armies during the Civil War, among them Captain Justus Scheibert of the Prussian Army. His reports back to Berlin described how the Americans had used the earth as armor and predicted that future wars between industrial powers would be decided not by movement, but by fortification and endurance. For most European generals, those warnings seemed theoretical, interesting but irrelevant to the age of quick, decisive battles. The lesson would take 50 years to sink in. The veterans of 1865 returned to a nation racing into modernity. Railroads expanded, telegraphs multiplied, and factories roared. Yet the soldiers who had fought at Petersburg carried with them the uneasy knowledge that technology, not courage, had become the deciding factor in war. The rifle musket, the telegraph, the railroad, each had tightened the noose around the idea of maneuver. The battlefield had become a machine, and men were its cogs. When war erupted in Europe in 1914, the generals of Britain, France, and Germany marched into battle with the same optimism that had driven the Union and Confederate armies 50 years earlier. They spoke of swift victories and glorious charges. Within months, those illusions disintegrated under the fire of repeating rifles and machine guns, the direct descendants of the Minié ball and Springfield rifle. The soldiers dug, just as their fathers had in Virginia. They built continuous trench lines from the North Sea to the Swiss border, complete with communication trenches, dugouts, and saps. Their war was fought by engineers and artillerymen as much as infantrymen. The landscape of Verdun, Ypres, and the Somme echoed the fields of Petersburg and Cold Harbor, only larger, deeper, and deadlier. Few remembered the American origins of those ideas. Textbooks credited European innovation, but the logic of the trenches, that industrial firepower made open battle suicidal, and that survival required the spade, was born in the red clay of Virginia. The Union soldiers of 1864 had already discovered what the world of 1914 would learn at staggering cost, that in the age of rifled steel and mass production, mobility was a myth, and courage, without cover, was suicide. The irony was cruel. The men who had dug to survive the Civil War had no thought of invention, no vision of reshaping global warfare. They dug because they were afraid, because they were tired, because they wanted to see the next sunrise. Yet their instinct had outpaced the intellect of every general who commanded them. They had glimpsed the logic of the modern battlefield decades before the scholars, strategists, and theorists would give it a name. After Appomattox, they went home to plow fields and build railroads, their hands still calloused from shovels. They left no monuments for the trenches they carved, no medals for the ingenuity that kept them alive. But, in a quiet, grim way, they had already changed the future. The age of the glorious charge had ended, replaced by a world where war was waged from the ground down. The soldiers of 1865 had buried not just their comrades, but an entire philosophy of warfare. They thought they were digging for protection. In truth, they were digging the grave of the old world. They dug to live, one Union veteran wrote years later, and in doing so, they taught the world how to die.